Hey there, viewers. Have you ever uncovered a secret so troubling about someone in your life that it made you question everything you believed you knew about them? Share your thoughts in the comments. Today's story dives into the moment Diddy vanished, and the victim who just exposed his horrific crimes has everyone reeling. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The phone call no one expected. It had been years since I had anything to do with the music industry. I left that life behind, packed it up in a box, and shoved it deep into the part of my mind where old regrets and bad memories collect dust. I had no interest in digging it up again. I had seen too much, done too much, and when you've been in the room while certain deals go down, you learn real quick that the only way to keep breathing is to stay silent and stay gone. That was the life I built for myself, a quiet one, far removed from the gold-plated chaos of the industry. No more late nights with men who laughed like they owned the world. No more watching young, desperate artists get chewed up and spat out. No more looking the other way. And then the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the screen as it vibrated against the kitchen counter. Nobody calls me anymore. Not from that world. Not unless they want something. I should have let it go to voicemail. I should have ignored it. But something in me reached for the phone anyway, like some instinct I had buried a long time ago was crawling back up to the surface. I answered. At first there was nothing, just dead air. And then a voice, shaky, breathless, a woman's voice. "Don't hang up," she said. I didn't respond, I just listened. She hesitated like she was struggling to get the words out. "I need to talk to you." Her voice had that kind of urgency you don't fake. It was the kind of voice people use when they think they're running out of time. I exhaled through my nose, already regretting answering the call. "Listen, I don't do this anymore." "You don't understand," she cut in. "This isn't about you, it's about him." Him. I knew who she meant before she even said the name. Sean Combs. Diddy's. The man who had once been untouchable. The one who had built an empire out of nothing and convinced the world he was the king of it all. The one now sitting in a jail cell, waiting for the day his sins caught up to him in a courtroom. I should have hung up. I should have told her I didn't care. But she was still talking, and her voice, it was unraveling, trembling at the edges. I could hear it in her breath. Fear, real, bone-deep fear. "They're saying it's over," she whispered. "That he's done, that all of this is finished." I said nothing. She let out a shuddering breath. "But it's not over. It's only beginning." I ran a hand over my face. My pulse was starting to climb. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be a part of whatever this was. "You're wasting your time," I told her. "If you've got something to say, take it to the feds. They're the ones handling this now." She let out a laugh, low and humorless. "You really think they're gonna do the right thing?" Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. "What do you want?" I asked. Silence. Then she said a name, and the world tilted. I gripped the edge of the counter, suddenly unsteady. My ears were ringing, my mouth went dry. I knew that name, knew it well, knew that person was dead. At least, that's what I had believed. That's what everyone believed. But this woman on the phone, this ghost from a past I had no business reopening, she just said their name like they were still alive. And then, just like that, the line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence stretch on. I'd tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, that she was lying, that it was some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I already knew. I knew this was the moment. The moment when all the ghosts I thought I buried started clawing their way back to the surface. I spent the next hour staring at my phone, willing it to ring again. It didn't. Outside, the sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the walls. I ran my tongue over my teeth, my stomach twisting itself into knots. That name. I could still hear her voice saying it, could still feel the way my body reacted before my mind even caught up. I got up and started pacing. I didn't want to go digging. I really didn't. But I also knew myself too well. I wasn't going to be able to let this go. I grabbed my laptop off the coffee table and opened it, the screen casting a cold glow over my face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Where do you even start looking for someone who doesn't exist anymore? I typed their name, hit enter, watched the search results load, and the first thing I noticed, there wasn't a single obituary. I swallowed hard, my throat clicking. Maybe that didn't mean anything. Maybe it was a mistake. But my gut told me otherwise. I clicked through news articles trying to find something, anything that confirmed what I thought I knew. Nothing. No funeral announcements. No records of their death. Just silence. My chest tightened. And that's when the cold realization crept in. This person didn't just disappear. They were erased. The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing against my lungs. My fingers tightened around the edges of the laptop. I shouldn't have answered the phone. I shouldn't have let her speak. I should have just ignored it and gone about my life, pretending like none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. And now I was in it. And there was no turning back. I sat in the dim glow of the screen, running through every possibility, every explanation that wasn't the one I was starting to believe. Because if this was real, if that name she gave me really did belong to someone still breathing, then everything I thought I knew about that world, about what happened behind those closed doors, was a lie. I had spent years trying to forget. Now it was all coming back. I pushed the laptop aside and exhaled sharply. My pulse was still hammering. I needed air. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside, letting the night swallow me up. The city was quiet. Too quiet. I rubbed at my temples, trying to piece it all together, but there were too many missing pieces. And then, as I turned the corner onto the empty street, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The text. No number. Just one sentence. Don't look for them. I stopped walking. My grip tightened around the phone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I lifted my head, scanning the street. The shadows felt deeper now, like something was watching. Like I had already made a mistake I couldn't take back. And for the first time in years, I felt afraid. Chapter 2. The name that should have stayed buried. I told myself I wasn't going to dig. I told myself I would let it go. The text had been a warning, clear and direct, and I wasn't stupid enough to ignore the weight behind it. I had walked away from that world for a reason. I had seen what happened to people who went looking for things that were meant to stay buried. I had spent years making sure I wasn't one of them. But my mind wouldn't stop circling back to it. That name? It gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, refusing to be ignored. I couldn't stop hearing it, the way she had said it, low, rushed, as if she was afraid of even speaking it aloud. I had been there the night they disappeared. I remembered it too well. I remembered the way the party had shifted, how the energy in the room had changed, how someone had whispered something in Diddy's ear, and how, just like that, the laughter had died. People left, some in a hurry, some pretending like they hadn't noticed anything was wrong. I had done the same. I knew better than to ask questions. That night, I had walked away and told myself I wouldn't think about it again. And for years, I hadn't. But now I had no choice. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open in front of me, the glow of the screen casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a second before I typed the name. I braced myself for what I already knew I'd find. Nothing. Not a single obituary, no death certificate, no missing person report, no funeral records. It was as if they had simply stopped existing. I swallowed, my throat dry. That didn't make sense. I knew what had happened. Everyone in that room had known, so why wasn't there anything? Why hadn't there ever been anything? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand down my face. This was the moment when I should have stopped. When I should have recognized that I was standing on the edge of something that would pull me in too deep. But the silence, the complete absence of information, only made it worse. Someone had made sure there was nothing to find, and I needed to know why. I started making calls. Not the kind of calls you can make during the day, not the kind of calls you can make to people with clean hands. These were old numbers, ones I hadn't dialed in years, numbers I had told myself I would never use again. Most didn't pick up. A few did, only to hang up the moment I mentioned the name. One of them, an old studio engineer used to work with, didn't even say hello, just answered and immediately said, "Don't call me again." Then the line went dead. That was the kind of reaction that told me I wasn't just remembering things wrong. It told me that I wasn't the only one who had spent years pretending that night had never happened. But one person did agree to talk. He didn't sound happy about it. "Meet me at the Hollow," he said, voice low. 1 hour. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand. The Hollow. It wasn't the kind of bar where people went to be seen. It was a place for the forgotten, for the ones who needed to drink without looking over their shoulders. The kind of place where, if someone was asking questions you didn't like, you could make sure they didn't ask again. I grabbed my jacket and left. By the time I pulled up to the bar, the sky had turned that deep, bruised blue that comes just before the city gives itself over to the night. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, one of the letters half burnt out. I stepped inside, the air thick with smoke and old secrets. The place was nearly empty, just a few scattered figures hunched over their drinks, their faces lost in the dim light. And in the back, in a booth half hidden in the shadows, sat my contact. He was older now. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. I slid into the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, setting it on the table between us. An old grainy photograph. I stared at it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was the kind of image you had to squint at, the quality so bad it almost blurred the details. But then I saw the face, and my stomach dropped. It was them. The person I had been told was gone. The person whose name had vanished from every record. And the timestamp on the photo was recent. I forced myself to swallow, my throat tight. "Where did you get this?" He didn't answer right away. He just watched me, studying my reaction. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice to a murmur. "You don't want to know what he did to keep them quiet." The words hit me like a fist to the gut. I looked back down at the photo, my fingers tightening around the edges. Alive. Somehow, against everything I had believed, they were alive. But my contact was right. I didn't want to know what had been done to keep it that way. But I was already in too deep. I had already opened a door I couldn't close. And I had the sinking feeling that whatever had really happened that night, the truth was going to be worse than anything I could imagine. Chapter 3, The First Victim Speaks. She didn't want to meet in public, that much was clear. After a brief, strained conversation on the phone, she had given me an address, an old apartment building on the outskirts of the city, far from the glass towers and studio lots where her past had been built. I didn't recognize the area, but I recognized the intent. She wanted to be somewhere forgotten, where no one would look twice at a man walking into a run-down complex in the middle of the night. The building was old, its foundations settling in a way that made the walls crack, the paint peel in long curling strips. The hallway smelled of damp carpet and something faintly medicinal, like bleach that had been left to dry. The lights flickered, buzzing with the kind of soft hum that reminded me of places where people disappeared quietly, where secrets soaked into the walls and no one ever asked questions. I reached her door and knocked twice, keeping my hand close to my pocket, not out of fear, but out of habit. The door cracked open just enough for me to see a single eye peering out, wide and darting to the left, then to the right, scanning the hallway like she expected someone to be watching. She must have recognized me, or at least convinced herself she didn't have a choice, because she unlatched the door and let me in. She was thinner than I remembered, her frame swallowed up by an oversized hoodie, her hair pulled back into a loose knot, strands falling around her face like she hadn't had the energy to fix them. Her hands trembled slightly as she locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place with a sharp click. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. She took a step back, exhaling, and for the first time, I got a good look at her. She had the look of someone who had been waiting too long to tell a story she knew no one would believe. "I don't have much time," she said finally. I nodded, pulling out my phone, ready to record. "Then let's not waste any." She hesitated, her lips pressing together. "No cameras," she said. "No pictures, just audio." I had expected as much. I hit record, placed my phone on the table, and waited. At first, she didn't speak. She just stared at the phone, the red light blinking like some kind of warning, as if saying the words aloud would make them real again. Then finally she whispered, "I was one of his girls." I didn't react. I kept my expression blank, my body still. I knew if I moved, if I flinched even slightly, she might shut down. "I was 19, she continued, "when it started." Her voice was thin, the words carefully measured, like she was reliving it in her head as she spoke. "It wasn't overnight, it never is. They make you think it's your choice." She swallowed, her fingers tightening into fists in her lap. "They bring you in slow, little things, invitations, exclusive parties. You feel special, you think you're lucky. Everyone else is fighting to be there, and you..." Her breath hitched slightly. "You don't even have to ask, they just hand it to you." She looked up at me for the first time, her eyes searching mine for something. Recognition, maybe. Or maybe she just wanted to see if I was really listening. "You know how it goes," she said. "You were in it." I said nothing. She took that as an answer. "They watch you," she went on. "Before you even step foot in a room, they already know how far they can push you. They know what you want, what you need, what you're missing. And if you don't got a weak spot, they'll make one." Her hands moved restlessly, pulling at the sleeves of her hoodie. "At first, it's just parties, fun, drinking, laughing. They put you next to the right people, make you feel like you belong, and then the favors start." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You're not like the other girls. That's what they say. They act like you're different, special. But it's all a game, a long one, and by the time you realize you're playing, you've already lost." I shifted slightly in my seat, my muscles tightening at the edges of her words. She inhaled sharply through her nose. "You think you're in control, but you're not. They make the rules. They decide when you've given enough, when you've proven yourself." Her voice dropped lower, almost too low for the mic to pick up. "And if you say no..." Her lip twitched slightly. "You find out real fast how much power you don't have." She glanced toward the window, as if expecting someone to be standing outside. "I saw things." I leaned forward slightly. "What kind of things?" She hesitated. Then finally, the islands. A weight settled between us, thick and unspoken. I knew what she was talking about. The private estates, the ones they flew out to on jets with no official flight records. The ones where security was tighter than a federal facility, where no phones were allowed, where the guest lists were filled with names that should have never been in the same rooms together. The places where the worst things happened. She exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. Some of the girls, she trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. They didn't come back. My jaw clenched. She licked her lips, her hands gripping the edges of her sleeves again. You ever notice how some of them just disappeared? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She stared at me for a long moment. Then finally she whispered, "They didn't just leave." The silence in the room felt suffocating. "They make examples," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "When someone steps out of line." I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "People think they got away," she murmured, "that they just ran, but that's not what happened." She looked down at the table, shaking her head. "There's one," she said, "one that's still—" She stopped. Her breathing hitched slightly. I could feel my own body tensing, waiting for her to say it. But she just shook her head again, gripping her sleeves tighter. "They're still trapped," she whispered. "Somewhere." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and thick. She swallowed, her throat bobbing. I thought, maybe, after all this, they'd finally let them go. She let out a short, bitter laugh. Guess I was stupid to think that. My fingers tightened slightly around my phone, the red recording light still blinking. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her face again, and then, finally, she whispered, "They're never gonna let them out." I pressed my lips together. She finally looked up at me again, her eyes dark and unreadable. "I shouldn't have called you," she muttered. "We did you?" I asked. Her expression hardened slightly. "Because I thought someone should know," she said simply. The room felt colder now. I took a slow breath, exhaled, and reached for my phone. I stopped the recording, and in that moment I knew I had just stepped into something I couldn't walk away from. Chapter 4. The list no one wants to acknowledge. No, I couldn't sleep. Not after what she had told me, not after the way her voice had cracked when she said it. "There's one that's still trapped." The words sat heavy in my skull, looping over and over like a song I couldn't shut off. Somewhere out there, someone was still living the nightmare she had escaped from. Someone had been left behind. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the shifting glow of passing headlights filter in through the blinds. The room felt too quiet, the silence pressing in on me, suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to let this go before I got pulled under. But I had already started sinking. I sat up, rubbing a hand down my face, and reached for my laptop. If I was going to do this, I needed proof, something concrete, something that wouldn't just be another whispered story lost in the void. I started with the places I knew. There had always been rumors, whispered conversations in the back corners of industry parties. Murmurs passed between executives when they thought no one was listening. A few places came up again and again. The private islands, the offshore estates, the luxury hotels where security was tighter than any government facility. I dug into flight logs first. They were harder to come by, especially now that so many of them were scrubbed from public records. But nothing ever disappears completely. If you know where to look, if you know the right names, sometimes you find cracks. The first few logs were exactly what I expected. Routine flights. Celebrities, executives, politicians, all traveling in and out of the same luxury destinations. Then a pattern started to emerge. I cross-referenced old event invites, archived news articles, and industry reports. Certain names came up again and again. It wasn't just musicians, it wasn't just actors. It was everyone. Billionaire CEOs, media moguls, politicians, some still in power, some who had carefully stepped out of the spotlight just before certain stories started surfacing. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the names. Some were expected, names that had long been whispered about, people who had been seen at all the wrong parties, photographed in all the wrong places. But others? Others were shocking. I ran a hand through my hair, my pulse starting to pick up. These weren't just industry figures, these were untouchable people. Men who sat on boards that controlled the flow of money, the flow of information, people who could make or break careers with a phone call. And Diddy had been right in the middle of it. I scrawled further, clicking through archived articles, trying to find anything, any reason why these names kept appearing together, why these flights lined up so perfectly with the nights when things allegedly happened. And that's when I found it. Buried deep in an old, forgotten forum thread, long since abandoned, there was a single post detailing a rumor that had circulated years ago. A list. A record of who had been where, who had attended, who had been there to see everything happen. It wasn't just hearsay. It was kept, documented by Diddy himself. My breath caught in my throat. I scrolled further, my eyes moving too fast, trying to take in as much as I could before the page disappeared, or my connection got mysteriously cut. The rumor was specific. He kept videos, photos, contracts, blackmail material. He had insurance on people, and if that list ever surfaced, it wouldn't just take down individuals, it would burn the entire industry to the ground. I closed the laptop, my pulse hammering in my ears. If that list was real, if those files still existed, then I wasn't the only one looking for them. I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking. I needed confirmation. I needed to know if this was more than just speculation. I called my informant. She picked up on the first ring. "I need you to tell me everything you know about the records he kept," I said, skipping past pleasantries. "The files, the footage, the list." She went quiet. "Worry?" she asked after a long moment. "Because it's still out there," I said, "and I think someone's trying to find it." I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven. "Who?" I glanced toward the window, suddenly feeling like there were eyes on me, like the walls of my apartment weren't as solid as they seemed. "I don't know," I admitted. Silence. Then finally she whispered, "They won't let it get out." I gritted my teeth. "I don't care what they want. If it's real, it needs to be exposed." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about Diddy. He was a piece of it, yeah, but that list, it's bigger than him. You think they locked him up because of some moral obligation? No, he got sloppy, he became a liability, and now they're making sure he's the only liability." My stomach twisted. She was right. They weren't protecting him, they were cleaning up the mess he left behind. I exhaled through my nose, rubbing my temple. "So where is it?" I asked. "The files?" "The list." She hesitated. "Gone," she said finally. "Or buried so deep no one will ever find it." I didn't believe that. People like him don't destroy leverage. They don't erase power. They hide it. And if it was hidden, someone somewhere knew where it was. I hung up and sat in silence, my mind racing. I had one more call to make. One last contact, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. I pulled up the number, hesitated for only a second, then dialed. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in a long, long time. "I was wondering when you'd call," they said. My throat went dry. "You know why I'm calling?" I said. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Yeah," they said. "I do." A beat of silence. Then their voice dropped lower. "Meet me in person," they said. "I'm not talking about this over the phone." The line went dead. I sat there, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. For the first time since this started, I felt it. I was being watched. Chapter 5. A quiet threat in the dead of night. I knew something was wrong before I even reached my front door. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first. Just a feeling, a wrongness in the air, something pressing against the edges of my senses like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. The hallway leading up to my apartment was too still, the usual flickering of the overhead lights absent, leaving the air thick with an unnatural silence. I slowed my steps as I got closer, my breath steady but shallow. My door looked the same as I had left it. No scratches, no dents, no sign of forced entry. But as I reached for the handle, a cold weight settled in my stomach. It was already unlocked. I stood there for a long moment, my fingers hovering just above the metal. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I had locked it, I was sure of it. I had double-checked before leaving, just like I always did. My pulse thumped against my ribs, sharp and insistent. I had two choices. I could walk away, turn around, get in my car and drive where, I didn't know. But I could leave. Or I could go inside. I wasn't armed. I wasn't expecting a fight. But if someone was still in there, waiting, then I had already lost. I pushed the door open. The lights didn't turn on. I flicked the switch twice, but nothing happened. I stepped inside cautiously, my hands skimming along the wall as I moved forward, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The apartment smelled different. Stale air, dust disturbed, something slightly metallic underneath it all. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but when I pulled it out, the screen was black. I tried to turn it on, but it was dead. I hadn't let the battery die, I knew that for a fact. A quiet dread began clawing at the back of my mind as I took another step forward. My foot hit something on the floor. I crouched down and ran my hand over it. Papers scattered across the carpet. My eyes adjusted enough to make out the shapes of my furniture. The place was torn apart. Someone had gone through everything. Drawers were pulled out, their contents dumped carelessly onto the ground. Cushions slashed open, the stuffing spilling out like gutted insides. My desk was flipped, the chair on its side. I swallowed hard, moving through the wreckage slowly. No one was here now, I was sure of that much. But whoever had done this hadn't just been looking for something. They had left a message. I stepped into the kitchen. That's when I saw it. A single piece of paper sitting on the counter. No envelope, no signature, just 4 words written in thick, uneven ink. Walk away. My fingers curled into fists. I stared at the note, willing it to make sense. I had expected something like this eventually. I had known from the moment I started pulling at these threads that someone would notice. But that didn't make it any less real. A quiet threat. That's what this was. Not an open attack. Not a gun to my head or a shadow in the night. Just a warning. They want me dead. Not yet. They wanted me scared. I picked up the note, running my thumb over the edge. The ink was slightly smudged. Handwritten. That meant whoever had left it wasn't some distant entity pulling strings from behind a desk. They had been here. They had stood in this very room, close enough to reach out and touch my things, to tear through my life with their bare hands. I turned back toward the wreckage, scanning the room again. My laptop was gone. The hard drive where I kept my backups. Gone. All my notes, the physical copies, the files I had printed out for safekeeping, all gone. Every trace of what I had been looking into had been removed. They hadn't just come to scare me. They had come to erase what I knew. But they had made a mistake, because I still remembered. I knew the names. I knew the flights, the connections, the whispers that had trailed behind them like shadows. They could take my files, they could delete my evidence, but they couldn't wipe my mind clean. I inhaled slowly through my nose, steadying myself. This wasn't the kind of fight I had been prepared for. I wasn't a journalist or a whistleblower. I wasn't some righteous crusader looking to burn down an empire. But now, it didn't matter what I had planned. They had made this personal. I took another look around, forcing myself to think. The security cameras in the building were useless, I already knew that. The landlord never bothered fixing them. There would be no footage, no blurry images of the intruders leaving with my things. But someone had to have seen something. I grabbed my keys and stepped back out into the hallway, making my way to the only neighbor who ever seemed to notice anything. Mrs. Alvarez had lived in this building for 30 years. She spent most of her evenings sitting by her window, watching the street below like it was her personal television. If someone had been coming in or out of my apartment while I was gone, she would know. I knocked twice. There was a shuffling noise behind the door before it creaked open just enough for her to peer out. Her face was lined with age, her eyes sharp despite the tired weight behind them. She frowned when she saw me. "They were in your place," she said, before I could even ask. My stomach tightened. "When?" "Couple hours ago," she said, voice low. "3 men. Didn't look like cops. Didn't look like movers." I kept my face still, my pulse picking up. "What did they look like?" She squinted slightly, thinking. "One of them was tall, real broad. Other 2 were smaller, but they moved like they knew what they were doing." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Didn't seem like a random break-in, if that's what you're hoping." I exhaled through my nose. Of course it wasn't. "They take anything?" she asked, eyeing me closely. "Yeah," I said, "but nothing worth money." That seemed to confirm whatever suspicion she had. She gave a slow nod. "You in trouble?" I hesitated. "Not yet." Her expression darkened. "If you got smart, you'd leave before you are." I had nothing to say to that. I thanked her and turned away, heading back to my ruined apartment, my mind racing. They weren't going to stop. Whoever they were, whatever they were trying to protect, it wasn't just about Diddy anymore. It wasn't just about him going down. This was bigger. The list, the people on it, the ones who had been part of it all but had managed to stay hidden. Diddy had made mistakes. He had gotten reckless, let his arrogance make him sloppy. That's why he had been caught. But the ones who still had power? The ones who still had control? They weren't about to let someone like me pull them down with him. I looked down at the note again. Walk away. They expected me to? They expected me to be scared, to take this as my chance to back off before things got worse. But I wasn't scared. Not anymore. They had taken everything I had. But they had left me alive. And that was their second mistake. Chapter 6. The footage that changes everything. The first time I saw the video, it had already spread too far to be erased. I had been keeping my head down since the break-in, moving carefully, watching my back. Every night I checked my locks, twice, wedged a chair under the doorknob like that would stop anything, slept with my shoes by the bed in case I had to leave fast. But I still wasn't prepared for this. The video surfaced out of nowhere, first in whispers, then as a tidal wave that no one could contain. A short, grainy clip uploaded anonymously. No caption, no explanation, just a few seconds of footage that was never meant to see the light of day. I clicked the link and the screen flickered. The setting was familiar, a party but not the kind with velvet ropes and champagne glasses. This was the other kind, the kind that had always been whispered about but never confirmed, the kind that had ruined lives. The camera was shaky, but the scene was clear enough. The music was too loud, bass rattling through the speakers, making the screen vibrate slightly. The lighting was dim, but not enough to obscure the figures moving in the background. There was laughter, slurred words exchanged between bodies pressed together in the haze of alcohol, smoke, and something thicker, something heavier. And then the camera tilted, and there he was, Diddy, front and center, laughing, relaxed, completely at ease in the chaos around him. It wasn't old footage. You could tell by the way he looked. His hair, the lines on his face, the slight gray in his beard. This wasn't decades-old party footage from his heyday. This was recent. And he wasn't alone. Someone else was there with him. Someone famous? I felt my chest tighten. I replayed the clip, trying to convince myself I was seeing things, but there was no mistaking it. This wasn't some random hanger-on, some nameless person lost in the decadence. This was a name too big to ignore. A politician. Not just any politician. Someone still in power. Someone whose entire career would burn to the ground if this video was real. I shut my laptop so hard it nearly cracked. My pulse hammered in my ears. My thoughts spiraled. Who leaked this? Why now? Was this a warning, a message, a trap? I tried to push those questions aside and focus on what mattered. This wasn't just about Diddy anymore. This was about everyone he had taken down with him. The media went into full-blown panic mode. Headlines flooded in within hours. Explosive new footage surfaces, Diddy linked to unnamed political figure. Alleged party video raises questions about high-profile attendees. Attorneys denounce leaked clip as AI-generated smear campaign. The spin machine moved fast. Diddy's legal team immediately claimed it was fake, AI-generated, a deep fake meant to smear his reputation. But that wasn't sticking. Too many people had seen it before the damage control kicked in. Too many had already recognized the location, the energy, the patterns. Then my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me not to answer. I answered anyway. "I saw it," I said before they could speak. A pause. Then, the voice came through, quiet, rushed, scared. "There's more." I swallowed hard. My grip on the phone tightened. "I need to see it," I said. Another pause. "I don't think you do," they whispered. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "Then why call me?" The line was quiet for a long moment. And then, because it's not just footage. A pit formed in my stomach. I turned toward the window, my eyes scanning the street outside my apartment, searching for shadows that weren't supposed to be there. "What does that mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Another beat of silence, then, barely above a whisper. "It means the list wasn't the only thing he kept." My pulse kicked up. "How much are we talking?" A breath. Then a single flat statement. I stood there, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. "You need to get out of there," they said suddenly, their voice sharper now, urgent. "If they know you've seen this, you won't have time to run." I was already moving, already grabbing my bag, throwing on my jacket. "Where?" I asked. Another pause. "Somewhere without cameras," they whispered. "Somewhere they won't expect you to go." I glanced at the laptop still open on my desk. The video paused mid-frame, frozen in time like a loaded gun waiting to go off. I had spent years keeping my distance from this world. Now it had found me again, and I wasn't sure I was going to make it out this time. Chapter 7. The trial that was never meant to happen. The days leading up to the trial felt like waiting for an earthquake. You couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but you could feel it coming, pressing down on the city, stretching itself through every conversation, every whispered warning. People were bracing for something, even if they didn't know what. Diddy's legal team had been playing defense for months, scrambling to patch the cracks forming in a dam that was never meant to hold. The leaks kept coming, the stories kept spreading, and now, with the footage out in the open, the trial wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. The government knew what was at stake. The industry was in panic mode. And then, witnesses started disappearing. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't quiet. At first it was small things. People missing depositions, lawyers issuing statements that their clients were reconsidering participation. The kind of soft pullbacks that happen when fear settles in, when the price of speaking out outweighs the relief of telling the truth. Then it got worse. One of the key witnesses, an ex-employee who had promised under oath to testify, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Her family reported her missing. She had left her apartment as usual, but never showed up to work. Her phone went dead. No goodbye texts, no withdrawals from her bank account. Just gone. The news barely covered it, just a small headline buried under the latest political nonsense. No connection to the trial was ever made publicly, and yet people in the industry knew. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said in court. One by one, other witnesses followed suit. Some recanted their stories completely, issuing legal statements saying they had misremembered things, or that lawyers had misrepresented their words. Some refused to go to court at all, and a few just vanished, like they had never existed in the first place. I wasn't shocked. I had seen what happened to people who knew too much. But I also knew that whoever was orchestrating this wasn't just covering for Diddy anymore. This was bigger than him, bigger than one man. The system itself was shaking, and someone somewhere was deciding who had to be cut loose before the whole thing came crashing down. I had been careful. I had kept my head down, stayed quiet, kept moving. But even then, I knew it was only a matter of time before they turned their eyes on me. I wasn't a witness. I wasn't a victim. But I was in the way. And when you get in the way of people like this, they give you one chance to move. That chance came in the form of a phone call. Not a threat. Not a warning. An offer. I knew it was coming before I even answered. The number was blocked. The voice was calm, professional, like this was just another business transaction. They weren't sloppy, they weren't emotional. This wasn't some last-ditch effort to scare me off. This was structured, planned, a process they had followed before. They laid it out plain and simple. You've done your part. We don't need you to continue this. If you stop now, you walk away clean. I didn't answer. I just let them talk. You have no legal obligation to testify. No subpoenas, no formal accusations. You're just an observer. So let it go. Let this trial happen the way it's supposed to. I forced my voice to stay steady. And if I don't? A small pause. Then, flatly, like they were reading off a script. Then we have a problem. I waited. You have people you care about. My chest tightened. Family, friends. You don't want them involved in something that has nothing to do with them. Think about them. A long silence. Then a final warning. The ones who take the deal always sleep better at night. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hands. They weren't bluffing. They weren't giving me a choice. And I didn't know what to do. There was no heroism in this, no righteous indignation. I wasn't a crusader. I wasn't a whistleblower. I was just a guy who had stumbled into something far bigger than himself, and now I had to decide if I was willing to take the fall for it. They knew how to make problems disappear. They had done it before, and if I didn't back off, I would be next. But if I took the deal, if I walked away just like they wanted, then they won. Diddy wasn't the real target here. He had been the face of it, the one reckless enough to get caught. But there were bigger players in this game, people who still had power, people who couldn't afford to be exposed. And the only thing standing between them and getting away with it all was the truth. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. They had already gotten to the witnesses. They had already silenced the ones who mattered. His trial. It was never meant to happen. And if it did, it would be on their terms. Not the courts. Not the public's. Not the victims. Theirs. The question wasn't whether or not justice would be served. The question was who would be sacrificed to make it look like it had been. And now I had to decide, would it be me? Or would I walk away just like they wanted? I took a slow breath, and for the first time since this started, I knew exactly what I had to do. But it wouldn't be easy, because if I chose to move forward, if I chose to expose what they were trying to erase, I might not make it out alive. Chapter 8. Diddy is gone, but the nightmare remains. The day of the trial arrived with an eerie sense of inevitability. The streets outside the courthouse were lined with reporters, their cameras fixed on the entrance, waiting for the moment that would define the collapse of an empire. Protesters stood in clusters, some holding signs demanding justice, others waving banners in blind support of a man they still believed was untouchable. But when the doors opened and the court officers began filing in, there was one glaring absence. Diddy wasn't there. At first, the speculation ran wild. Some said he had refused to leave his cell, that he had suffered a breakdown behind bars. Others whispered that he had struck some last-minute deal, that this was all part of a game being played at a level no one else could see. His lawyers issued a carefully crafted statement within the hour. Due to health concerns, Mr. Combs will not be appearing in person at today's proceedings. The court has been informed of his medical condition, and accommodations will be made accordingly. That was it. No specifics, no elaboration. Just a vague excuse designed to keep the press chasing its own tail. But I knew better. I had spent too long pulling at these threads, following the trail of names and faces that had hidden in the shadows for decades. I knew when something smelled rotten. This wasn't about health. This was protection. The people in power, the ones whose names had started surfacing in connection to him, weren't ready to let him take the stand. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And while the reporters scrambled to make sense of his absence, while his legal team maneuvered behind the scenes to keep him insulated, something else was happening in the background. The empire was crumbling. It started with the people who had once stood next to him, who had thrived under his shadow. The business partners, the investors, the so-called loyal allies who had smiled for cameras while the money poured in but were now distancing themselves as fast as they could. Companies quietly severed ties. Endorsements were pulled. Former friends and collaborators issued carefully worded statements condemning his alleged actions while making sure to remind the public that they had no prior knowledge of misconduct. One by one, the walls were closing in. But it wasn't just about money. The victims were speaking out. For years they had been silenced through fear, through coercion, through the overwhelming power of a machine that had been built to consume and discard people like them without consequence. But now, the floodgates had cracked. More women, more men, more stories. Some had been trapped in his orbit for years, unable to escape the gravitational pull of power and influence. Others had been on the outskirts, witnesses to the things they had been too afraid to acknowledge at the time. And now that he was falling, they weren't holding back anymore. I read through the statements as they emerged, one after another. Some were anonymous, others came with names attached. The details varied, but the patterns were the same. The parties, the islands, the promises made and the price paid in return. There had always been whispers about the ones who had disappeared, about the girls and boys who had entered those rooms and never truly left, even if they had walked out. But now those whispers were turning into evidence. It was harder to ignore when the victims weren't just faceless allegations, when the stories started connecting. And with each new testimony, the industry's worst-kept secrets were being dragged into the light. Names that had been protected for decades were now being spoken aloud. Producers, executives, celebrities who had smiled for cameras while knowing exactly what went on behind closed doors. And that was when the shift happened. Because this had never just been about Diddy. He had been a piece of the puzzle, sure, but he wasn't the whole picture. He was a product of a system that had allowed men like him to thrive unchecked for years. And now that the cracks were showing, now that the mask was slipping, the people who had enabled him weren't done fighting back. They weren't going to let this trial take them down with him. So they did what they did best. They controlled the narrative. They pushed stories out, one after another, filling the airwaves with just enough distractions to keep people from looking too closely. They spun conspiracy theories to discredit the victims, twisting their stories until the truth was tangled beyond recognition. They dug up dirt on the witnesses, painting them as unreliable, as opportunists looking for their 15 minutes of fame. They shifted the blame, rewriting history in real time, making sure that if anyone went down, it was only Diddy. Because as long as the world focused on him, they could keep the rest of their secrets buried. And the worst part, it was working. I could see it happening in real time, the way public opinion was already starting to fracture, the way the media was carefully steering the conversation away from the bigger picture. The machine wasn't just fighting back. It was winning. And me? I had a choice to make. I could keep fighting, keep pushing, keep risking everything to make sure this story didn't disappear into the abyss like so many others before it. Or I could do what they wanted. I could walk away. I could pretend none of this ever happened. That the list never existed. That the missing weren't still missing. That the people trapped in this nightmare weren't still out there, waiting for justice that would never come. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the glow of the laptop screen casting sharp shadows across my face. The weight of everything pressed down on me, a cold, relentless pressure that refused to let go. I thought about the threats, the warnings, the way the world had tried to convince me that this fight was already over. But it wasn't. Not yet. Because Diddy might be gone, but the nightmare wasn't. The system was still standing, and as long as it was still standing, people like him would rise again. They would rebuild, rebrand, shift the blame onto someone else. They would keep repeating the cycle unless someone did something to break it. I took a deep breath. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't walking away. Not this time. Not while the truth was still waiting to be told. Not while they still thought they could bury it. I reached for my phone, and I started making calls. Because if they wanted to burn this story down, I was going to make sure I set fire to everything they were trying to protect.